When you find yourself unable to act, when even the simplest task feels impossible, it is easy to label this state as laziness or weakness. But from the Jungian perspective, inertia is rarely a matter of willpower. It is a symptom of something deeper. The psyche is not a machine that can simply be switched on and off. It is a living organism, ruled by forces both conscious and unconscious. When motivation disappears, it is not that your energy has vanished, but that it has been withdrawn from the surface of consciousness and redirected inward. The unconscious, in its mysterious wisdom, withholds energy from the ego when the conscious direction of life no longer aligns with the deeper truth of the individual. Carl Jung observed that psychic energy, much like a river, does not stop flowing, it simply changes course. When the ego insists on moving in a direction that the deeper self does not endorse, the current of energy retreats underground. This inner withdrawal manifests outwardly as apathy, fatigue, and disinterest. The ego interprets this as failure or depression. But in truth, it is a message from the unconscious. Something within you requires your attention. The energy that once propelled you toward external goals is now seeking expression through an inner process of reflection or transformation. In modern life, where productivity is glorified and rest is seen as weakness, this message is often ignored. We are taught to push through, to discipline ourselves, to conquer inertia through willpower. Yet Jung would warn that forcing action, when the soul resists, it only deepens the division within. The more we suppress the unconscious demand for introspection, the more resistance we encounter. This is why periods of low motivation often grow worse the more we fight them. The unconscious does not respond to force, it responds to awareness. Inertia, then, is a symbolic language. It speaks for the parts of ourselves that have been neglected or suppressed. Perhaps you have pursued ambitions that no longer reflect your inner values. Perhaps you have ignored emotional wounds or creative impulses for the sake of practicality. When the unconscious senses that life has become one-sided, too focused on achievement, reason, or conformity, it compensates by halting the flow of energy to those pursuits. This withdrawal is not punishment but protection. The psyche is attempting to restore balance by pulling you away from activities that no longer nourish the soul. In Jungian terms, such moments mark the beginning of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. The absence of motivation is the psyche's way of demanding that you stop serving outer ideals and start listening to your inner reality. The unconscious invites you to descend into yourself, to explore what has been ignored or silenced. It may ask you to reflect on your relationships, your purpose, or your sense of meaning. It may urge you to reconnect with forgotten passions or confront truths you have long avoided. The ego, however, resists this descent because it threatens its control. The ego wants progress, movement, certainty. The unconscious wants depth, integration, authenticity. If you approach this state of inertia with curiosity rather than condemnation, it transforms from an obstacle into a teacher. Instead of asking, "Why can't I do anything?" ask, "What in me does not want to move?" Allow the answer to emerge slowly through dreams, journaling, or quiet contemplation. Often, what you find is that a part of you feels unheard or misused. Perhaps your inner child is weary of being driven by perfectionism. Perhaps your creative self feels suffocated by routine. When these neglected aspects of the psyche are acknowledged and given voice, the energy that was trapped in resistance begins to return. Jung compared this process to the rhythm of nature. Just as winter is not the death of life but its renewal, the psychological stillness prepares the ground for new growth. Inertia, too, has its season. It forces you to rest, to re-evaluate, to clear space for something more genuine to emerge. When you surrender to this rhythm instead of resisting it, you discover that your motivation does not need to be manufactured. It reawakens naturally once you realign with your inner truth. In this way, Inertia becomes not a curse but a compass. It points you toward what has been lost or overlooked. It reminds you that your energy belongs not to your ego's desires, but to your soul's evolution. What feels like a breakdown in productivity is, in fact, a breakthrough in awareness. The unconscious is not your enemy. It is your silent guide, always seeking to bring you closer to wholeness through the language of feeling, symbol, and resistance. If you can learn to listen when your motivation disappears, you will discover that even in stillness, something within you is moving, calling you back to the path that is truly yours. Human beings are driven not merely by external rewards or discipline, but by an inner sense of purpose that gives life vitality and direction. Carl Jung understood this intimately. Psychic energy, he said, is drawn toward that which holds meaning. When something loses its significance, our energy naturally recedes from it. The experience of having no motivation often signals not a lack of strength, but a lack of meaning. The soul withdraws its support from activities that no longer nourish it, forcing us to confront the deeper question of why we do what we do. In the modern world, we often confuse productivity with purpose. We fill our days with tasks, deadlines, and goals imposed from outside, believing that business is equivalent to fulfillment. Yet the psyche cannot be deceived for long. It knows when our actions lack emotional or spiritual substance. When the meaning behind our efforts fades, our energy dissipates as well. This is why people can appear successful on the surface, busy, accomplished, admired, and yet feel empty, restless, or unmotivated within. Their outer life no longer mirrors their inner truth. Jung believed that the human being is sustained by a sense of inner coherence, a feeling that one's life expresses something essential and true. When that coherence is lost, the psyche revolts. The energy that once flowed freely becomes stagnant. The unconscious begins to send signals in the form of apathy, fatigue, or disinterest. These symptoms are not signs of failure, but invitations to rediscover meaning. They indicate that your actions have become disconnected from your soul's intentions. In Jung's language, the libido, the psychic energy that drives all life activity, has withdrawn from the external world to seek new meaning within. To restore motivation, one must therefore look not outward for stimulation, but inward for significance. Ask yourself, what truly matters to me now? The answer may not come easily. Meaning is not something we can manufacture through logic or social expectation. It arises from authentic engagement with the symbols and values that speak to the self, the totality of the psyche. It might emerge through creativity, relationship, spiritual reflection, or service to something greater than oneself. When your actions express a truth that resonates with your deeper nature, energy begins to flow again without effort. This is why discipline alone cannot solve the problem of motivation. You can force the body to act, but you cannot force the soul to care. Motivation born from willpower alone is fragile. It exhausts itself quickly because it lacks emotional substance. Real motivation feels alive. It comes from alignment between the conscious mind and the unconscious meaning-making process. You no longer push yourself forward. You are drawn forward by something that feels both inevitable and deeply satisfying. Jung described this as being seized by a purpose, where one becomes the instrument of a greater unfolding rather than the sole author of it. Yet, to find that purpose, you must be willing to let go of false ones. Much of modern exhaustion comes from chasing goals that belong to others. Society's definitions of success, family expectations, cultural ideals of productivity. When you pursue these, your inner self eventually rebels. The loss of motivation becomes a protective act, a way for the psyche to reclaim energy from pursuits that are not truly yours. To recover meaning, you must examine which of your goals genuinely express your individuality and which are merely inherited scripts. Jung often said that a person cannot truly live until they discover what myth they are living by. Every life, consciously or not, unfolds within a personal myth, a narrative that gives it coherence and depth. When you feel aimless, it is because you have lost contact with that mythic dimension. You are acting, but without a story that makes sense of your actions. Reconnecting with this inner narrative restores vitality because the psyche thrives on purpose. Even the most mundane task becomes meaningful when it serves a larger vision of who you are and what you are becoming. To awaken this connection, begin with awareness rather than action. Notice what evokes curiosity, peace, or joy within you. These are clues from the unconscious, small sparks pointing towards sources of renewed energy. As you follow them, your motivation grows organically, without struggle. The more your outer life reflects your inner truth, the more effortlessly your energy flows. Energy follows meaning because meaning connects us to life itself. When you act in harmony with your authentic purpose, you participate in the unfolding of the self, the deeper totality of who you are. You become not merely a door, but a vessel through which life's energy moves freely and purposefully. Motivation is not something to be found. It is something that returns when you are living in alignment with what your soul deems meaningful. Within every human being exists a tension between two powerful forces, the ego and the self. The ego is the conscious part of the mind, the I that plans, desires, and identifies with achievements. It seeks control, success, and recognition. The self, on the other hand, represents the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the deeper intelligence that strives for wholeness, balance, and authenticity. The conflict between these two is at the root of many inner struggles, including the loss of motivation. When the ego and the self fall out of harmony, energy becomes fragmented, and the will to act fades away. The ego's primary concern is adaptation to the external world. It wants to function efficiently, to meet expectations, to maintain status and order. But when the ego dominates for too long, the deeper voice of the self begins to rebel. The self does not care about social success or the approval of others. It seeks meaning, psychological integration, and the fulfillment of one's unique potential. When your daily life becomes too centered on the demands of the ego, achievement, performance, perfection, the self withdraws its support. The result is that familiar feeling of emptiness, fatigue, and lack of direction. What you interpret as laziness is often the soul's protest against a life that no longer reflects its deeper truth. Carl Jung believed that psychic energy flows freely only when the conscious ego is aligned with the self's natural direction. When this alignment breaks, motivation dries up. The unconscious then begins to send signals through symptoms, disinterest, dissatisfaction, or a sense of meaninglessness. These are not punishments, but invitations to realign your outer life with your inner purpose. The self is always attempting to restore balance between the outer and inner worlds. When the ego resists this balancing process, life itself intervenes through failure, confusion, or apathy to guide you back toward authenticity. The ego believes it can command motivation through discipline and willpower. It sees success as the result of effort and control. But this approach fails when the energy of the psyche no longer supports the ego's agenda. Jung taught that the unconscious holds a vast reservoir of psychic energy that cannot be accessed through force. It responds to honesty and awareness, not coercion. If your ego's goals contradict your inner truth, the unconscious will withhold energy until the conflict is resolved. This is why you may find yourself paralyzed, unable to take action even on tasks you know are important. It is not weakness, it is misalignment. The key lies in dialogue rather than domination. The ego must learn to listen to the self instead of trying to suppress it. This begins with introspection, asking not, how do I push myself harder, but what does my deeper self want me to learn from this resistance? Often, the answer reveals that you have been living for the wrong reasons. pursuing goals that feed the ego's vanity but starve the soul. Perhaps your work no longer fulfills you, or you have neglected your creativity, emotions, or spiritual life. The absence of motivation is the psyche's way of signaling that your current path no longer serves your growth. Reconciliation between the ego and the self does not mean abandoning ambition or discipline. It means allowing your outer pursuits to be guided by inner purpose. The ego provides structure and focus, the self provides direction and meaning. When they cooperate, energy flows effortlessly. When they compete, inner conflict drains vitality. Jung likened this harmony to a dance. The ego must move in rhythm with the self, taking its cues from the deeper intelligence within. Only then can effort become meaningful and motivation arise naturally from a sense of inner rightness. In moments of stagnation, the temptation is to criticize yourself for not trying hard enough. Yet this judgment only strengthens the ego's control and deepens the division. A more fruitful approach is to cultivate awareness. Notice where your actions feel empty or mechanical. Notice what aspects of life spark curiosity, peace, or quiet satisfaction. These are signals from the self, guiding you toward alignment. As you begin to honor them, the blocked energy gradually returns. The loss of motivation is, therefore, not a failure but an opportunity for transformation. It marks the point where the ego must surrender its narrow agenda and open itself to the wisdom of the self. Through this surrender, a new kind of motivation emerges, one not driven by fear or pride, but by genuine connection to your deeper nature. You no longer act to prove your worth, you act because your actions express who you truly are. The dance between the ego and the self is the central drama of every human life. The ego gives us individuality, the self gives us wholeness. When the two are reconciled, energy flows like a river returning to its natural course. The will to act is no longer manufactured. It becomes an expression of life itself moving through you, effortless, purposeful, and alive. When we experience resistance, those moments when we cannot bring ourselves to act, when every effort feels strained or futile, we tend to see it as an obstacle, something to be conquered. In our culture of relentless productivity, resistance is treated as a personal defect, a failure of discipline or willpower. Yet, in the language of Jungian psychology, resistance is not an enemy but a message. It is the psyche's way of communicating that something within us is in conflict or out of alignment. To view resistance as a symbol rather than a problem is to recognize that it carries meaning, and that by interpreting it, we can uncover the hidden dynamics shaping our inner life. Carl Jung taught that the psyche is a self-regulating system. When one aspect of our life becomes exaggerated or neglected, the unconscious compensates to restore balance. Resistance often arises as part of this balancing act. For example, when the ego becomes too focused on external achievement, the unconscious may create feelings of fatigue or apathy to slow us down and redirect attention inward. What appears on the surface as procrastination or lack of motivation is, in truth, a signal that our current direction no longer serves our psychological wholeness. The psyche resists what is not authentic to the individual's deeper nature. If we meet resistance only with force, we miss its purpose. The more we try to push through it, the more entrenched it becomes. This is because resistance is not a mechanical obstacle, but a living symbol. It represents an inner part of ourselves that feels unheard, unseen, or misused. When we ignore this part, the unconscious intensifies its opposition until we finally listen. The appropriate response, therefore, is not to suppress resistance, but to engage with it. Ask yourself, what does this resistance want me to understand? What is it protecting me from? What truth might it be pointing toward? Often, resistance reveals a deeper conflict between the conscious and unconscious mind. The ego may have chosen a path that contradicts the needs of the soul. Perhaps you are pursuing goals that once felt meaningful but no longer resonate. Perhaps you are forcing yourself into a role that denies your creative or emotional side. The unconscious, in its wisdom, resists this inauthentic direction by withholding energy. This inner opposition ensures that you do not stray too far from your true path. Seen from this angle, resistance is not sabotage, it is guidance. To interpret resistance symbolically requires a shift in perspective. Instead of judging it morally, seeing it as weakness or laziness, you must approach it psychologically as you would a dream. Every dream contains symbols that express the unconscious in metaphorical form. Resistance functions in the same way. It says, something within you is not ready, or you are not listening to your deeper needs. When you treat resistance as a symbolic communication, rather than a barrier to overcome, you open the possibility of transformation. Jung often describes psychological growth as a dialogue between the conscious ego and the unconscious. Resistance is one half of that dialogue. It is the unconscious speaking in the only language it knows, through emotion, hesitation, and inertia. When you feel unable to move forward, the psyche is asking you to pause and reflect. This may be the moment to examine your assumptions, re-evaluate your values, or reconnect with parts of yourself that have been neglected. Sometimes, resistance signals that rest or introspection is needed before new action can emerge. Other times, it indicates that the direction you are forcing is fundamentally wrong for your deeper development. Only by listening can you discern which it is. This symbolic approach transforms the experience of resistance. Instead of battling against yourself, you enter into cooperation with your inner life. You begin to see that resistance carries wisdom. It prevents you from wasting energy on paths that are not truly yours. It protects your integrity by slowing you down when you are driven by ego, fear, or external pressure. The key is not to eliminate resistance, but to translate its message. Once understood, its energy often dissolves naturally, freeing you to act with renewed clarity and purpose. In many cases, what lies behind resistance is an unintegrated part of the psyche, a shadow element that has been repressed. Perhaps your resistance hides fear of failure, or a longing for authenticity, or anger at a life lived for others. By confronting these hidden emotions instead of avoiding them, you recover the energy that was trapped in opposition. What was once resistance becomes resource. In this sense, resistance is not a wall but a door, one that opens inward, toward greater self-knowledge. When you encounter resistance, therefore, treat it as an invitation rather than an interruption. Approach it with curiosity, not judgment. Ask what aspect of your psyche is speaking through it and what it wishes to teach you. The ego wants constant progress, but the soul seeks meaning. Resistance is the meeting point between the two, a symbolic reminder that true movement begins only when all parts of the psyche are heard. By listening to resistance instead of fighting it, do you discover that it was never the enemy of growth? It was the guardian of authenticity all along. In a world that glorifies constant movement and accomplishment, stillness is often mistaken for stagnation. Yet from a Jungian perspective, stillness is one of the psyche's most profound instruments of transformation. When you feel drained, unmotivated, or unable to move forward, it may not be a sign of failure, but of an inner process unfolding beneath the surface. The unconscious often withdraws energy from outward activity to redirect it toward inner development. What feels like paralysis to the ego is, in truth, the psyche's preparation for renewal. Carl Jung observed that the human psyche, much like nature, moves in cycles. There are times for outward expansion and creation, and times for retreat and integration. Modern culture values only the first phase, the visible productivity of doing and achieving. But psychological growth demands both. When energy recedes, when the outer life quiets, the unconscious begins to reorganize itself. The individual is drawn inward, sometimes unwillingly, into a state of reflection, confusion, or rest. In that stillness, Something new is being born, a more integrated version of the self that can only emerge when the old structures dissolve. Stillness often arrives disguised as emptiness. The ego, accustomed to controlling life through plans and progress, experiences this phase as frightening. It feels as though all meaning has vanished, all purpose evaporated. Yet this is precisely the moment when the deeper self begins to assert its influence. The ego's loss of direction is the soul's opportunity to realign the personality with a truer path. Jung described this process as the descent into the unconscious, a necessary withdrawal from the noise of the outer world to encounter the forgotten, neglected or undiscovered parts of oneself. During such periods, the instinct is to resist. We try to force productivity, to restore the old rhythm, to escape the discomfort of not knowing. But resistance only prolongs the process. The transformation through stillness requires surrender, the willingness to stop striving and to allow what is hidden to surface. In stillness, the psyche speaks in symbols, dreams, and intuitions. It reveals truths that cannot be grasped through logic or effort. These insights emerge quietly, often without our conscious will. The task is to listen, to observe without judgment, and to trust that meaning will reassemble itself in time. Many of Jung's patients who came to him during periods of depression or creative blockage were not ill in the ordinary sense. They were in transition. The old personality was breaking down so that a new one could take shape. Jung saw such phases not as pathology, but as initiation. Just as the caterpillar must dissolve into stillness before becoming a butterfly, the human psyche must sometimes pass through emptiness to achieve wholeness. This stage is uncomfortable because the ego cannot see the outcome. Yet the unconscious knows exactly what it is doing. Stillness allows the psyche to redistribute energy, heal fragmentation, and prepare for a new orientation toward life. True transformation is not achieved by constant striving, but by allowing the psyche to complete its natural rhythm of death and rebirth. When the outer activity ceases, the inner world becomes active. The unconscious reorganizes the meaning of past experiences, integrates forgotten emotions, and redefines values. When this process completes itself, motivation returns, not as a forced willpower, but as an organic expression of renewed purpose. The energy that seemed lost is not gone. It has merely been repurposed for a deeper, more authentic direction. Stillness is therefore not a passive state, but a deeply creative one. It is the psychic equivalent of soil lying fallow before the next harvest. Nothing seems to grow on the surface, yet beneath, the ground is being replenished. When you allow yourself to be still, you make space for the unconscious to restore balance. This is the secret rhythm of growth action, withdrawal, reflection, renewal. Without the pause, the movement becomes mechanical and unsustainable. In practical terms, embracing stillness means accepting periods of uncertainty and trusting the inner process. It may involve solitude, journaling, walking in nature, or simply sitting with your thoughts without trying to change them. These moments reconnect you with your own depths, where the seeds of new life are planted. Jung often said that the psyche knows more than the conscious mind. By surrendering to stillness, you give that deeper wisdom a chance to guide you. When you finally emerge from such a phase, you do not return as the same person. The stillness has reshaped you from within. You act not out of compulsion, but out of clarity. Your motivation is no longer driven by fear of falling behind, but by a sense of alignment with something essential and alive. What once felt like emptiness now reveals itself as transformation in disguise. The quiet moments you once resisted become the foundation for a more meaningful, integrated life. Through stillness, the psyche renews itself, and the individual learns that true progress often begins in the very places where everything appears to stand still. Every human being carries within them two sources of motivation, one that arises from the self and one that emerges from the shadow. The self, in Jungian psychology, represents the totality of the psyche, the center of wholeness, meaning, and authenticity. The shadow, on the other hand, contains the repressed, denied, and unacknowledged aspects of ourselves. When we act from the self, our energy flows naturally, guided by inner truth and purpose. When we act from the shadow, our motivation becomes contaminated by fear, pride, or the need for validation. Understanding this difference is essential for sustaining genuine motivation, for only what comes from the self endures without exhaustion. The modern world rewards shadow-based motivation. We are taught to seek approval, status, and superiority, to act not because something feels right, but because we fear being seen as inadequate. These external drives can produce temporary bursts of energy, but they drain the psyche over time. The shadow thrives on comparison and competition. It pushes us to achieve for the sake of proving our worth. Yet, no matter how much success we attain, the emptiness remains because our actions are disconnected from our deeper being. Jung warned that the shadow cannot be destroyed, it must be integrated. Until we recognize its influence, it will secretly dictate our choices, leading to cycles of burnout, resentment, and self-doubt. To act from the self requires awareness. The self does not shout or demand, it whispers. Its motivation is quiet, rooted in meaning rather than fear. It draws energy from alignment, from the sense that what we are doing expresses who we truly are. When your actions serve this inner purpose, effort no longer feels forced. You become absorbed in what Jung called the process of individuation, the unfolding of your unique psychological potential. In this state, productivity is not driven by anxiety, but by authenticity. You no longer chase goals to complete yourself. You act because you already feel whole. The distinction between acting from the self and from the shadow can be subtle yet profound. Imagine working towards success in your career. If your drive comes from the self, you are motivated by the desire to express your gifts, to contribute meaningfully, to participate in life's unfolding. If it comes from the shadow, you are driven by insecurity, by the need to prove your value or to escape feelings of inferiority. The outward behavior may look the same, but the inner experience is completely different. The self brings peace and vitality. The shadow brings tension and depletion. When motivation collapses, it is often because the shadow has been running the show. The unconscious grows wary of serving false ideals and withdraws its support. This is why people who achieve external success often find themselves unfulfilled. Their accomplishments are built on compensating for inner wounds rather than expressing genuine purpose. The psyche will not sustain energy for something that betrays its integrity. The loss of motivation, then, becomes an opportunity to reclaim it, not by forcing yourself to act, but by purifying the source of your action. The integrating the shadow is not about rejecting ambition or emotion. It is about recognizing their roots. When you feel the urge to prove yourself, pause and ask, what am I really seeking? Approval, control, safety. Each answer reveals a piece of the shadow, some hidden fear or desire that needs to be acknowledged and accepted. Jung emphasized that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal. When you accept your shadow rather than suppress it, its energy becomes available to the self. What once fueled anxiety transforms into creative power. Acting from the self also means surrendering the obsession with outcome. The ego, influenced by the shadow, measures everything by success or failure. The self measures by authenticity, by whether an action resonates with the truth of your being. This shift liberates enormous energy. You begin to act not because you must, but because something within you wants to be expressed. Your work becomes an act of participation in life rather than a battle against yourself. The self moves effortlessly. It does not struggle for motivation, because it is animated by meaning itself. Jung believed that when we live in accordance with the self, we align with the natural rhythm of the psyche and the world. Life ceases to feel like resistance. Even challenges carry purpose. and effort becomes a form of devotion rather than drudgery. The difference between acting from the self and from the shadow is the difference between living from fullness and living from deficiency. When the shadow drives us, we are always chasing something outside ourselves. When the self leads, we discover that everything we seek already lies within. The journey, then, is not to eliminate the shadow, but to bring it into relationship with the self, to act consciously rather than react unconsciously. Each time you choose authenticity over fear, presence over performance, you draw closer to psychological wholeness. The motivation returns not as a task to be managed, but as the natural expression of a life aligned with its inner center. To act from the self is to act in harmony with life itself, a movement that needs no justification, because it is, in its essence, alive.